Welcome to the Love Conscious Human Podcast, your launch pad to cultivate and elevate your personal power. I'm your host, business strategist, and leadership coach, Dr. Terry. Let's have fun and jump right in. Hi, Sarah. Thank you for coming on to the Love Conscious Human Podcast. Can you tell the listeners just real quick a little something about yourself and
Sure.
what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Sarah Neal, and I've been in the HR field for over 25 years now, and currently head up a learning and development team. I sit in the Boston area, and I have 2 teenage children and a husband that I live with in my home along with my dog. That's me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So yeah, and also full disclosure, Sarah and I worked together. I was her coach. So Sarah, I really want to talk to you a lot about your experience, flipping the switch, moving out of this war consciousness into this love consciousness. And we're going to have a conversation about what it means to be a love conscious human.
It's a work in progress, but yes, I'll get there, Dr. Terry.
We're all working on it. I think it's actually just being on the journey is the number one reward where we start out, right? That's the low-hanging fruit of just feeling better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So as an L&D executive, and you've got all these years of experience in HR, can you describe for us what is war consciousness in this business space that shows up that you see?
Yeah, I mean, my experience is where war consciousness may show up is when there's conflicting opinions, and I know I'll call it ego, where people have this strong sense of how things should get done and can't let go of it, and are not able to collaborate and not able to kind of gain input from others. So I definitely see it a lot in the business world where especially working on teams and managing employees and dealing with stakeholders and getting to alignment and agreement on things, that can be a real challenge because people are very embedded in what they believe the outcomes should be and what they believe the strategy or the way in which things are done and how they go about it. So I see it a lot in the business world, and I see it a lot specifically with leading people.
Yeah. And when you say that, immediately it pops for me that, like, okay, because for our listeners always to educate, is that the war conscious is fundamentally somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And when you're in that duality, that there's no way to align. There's no way to innovate. There's no way to find a solution if somebody's right and we have to make somebody wrong.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, and that I've struggled with it, and so I think I do feel like some of the tips in the Flip Your Switch book has really helped me to kind of reset how I address those things in a different way, right? So it is trying to come to agreement and really listening and understanding that person's perspective before having an opinion and directing how things should go or informing, right? So it's really listening on both sides to the deep issue of why, and then what is holding that person back from gaining alignment.
I love what you just did. You went into the open questions. When you talked about gaining alignment and getting clarity, getting to the bottom issue, even in your example, you were using those questions like open questions. And I know that as an executive, it's always a game changer when you switch from, is this like the right or wrong to,
Yes.
okay, what's happening? How are you feeling? What are you doing? Where
Tell
are the
me, tell me
hurdles?
why, yeah, tell me why you believe that, or tell me what's holding you back from that, right? So asking those really, and you've taught me that, is really asking those really bigger questions, because the narrower the focus, the harder it is to get people to move away from what they believe to be true.
Correct. Exactly. And that's also very interesting. You said what they believe to be true.
Yes.
Because everybody has that narrative
Hmm.
of how the world works. They have that, your perception and the belief system, and then the narrative, and then we have all of our, you know, dysfunction. Because I don't know anybody
That's right.
that has come up in a fully functional family. I mean, I love it when people say, "Oh yeah, I had a dysfunctional family." I'm like, I don't know anybody who doesn't. Is it just me?
You're like, do I attract those people? I don't know. Everybody. Everybody's
Everybody.
part of that.
Everybody's a part of that mess.
Yeah.
And so there's, allowing that, and knowing that there's this messiness that's going to be there. It's just, I guess it's just part of the way we need to work with each other.
And I would say,
Yeah.
like, some of that, I I I had to flip my switch. I had to think about it differently, but I also had to spend some time really with my feet fully on the ground and really opening and being vulnerable to the answers that I might not even want to hear, right? So I think that that's also the challenge. And I think as executives, there is this expectation that you have all the answers. And so you grow up in a corporation or organization, and you're led to believe that your executives are the decision makers and their opinion matters the most. And so you do have to shift if you, in my opinion, want to be a really great leader, is you have to shift your mindset of you're not just a decision maker. You have to also make sure that you're using your team and listening and really getting um, um, all perspectives versus just your own, because you can't
Yeah.
be everywhere. You can't know everything. And so that was a bit of a aha of like, I don't need to do it all or have all the answers. And I think Dr. Terry, you had said to me that, and it's in your book too, that we assume we are the we look at ourselves as an element of productivity, and as an executive and as a leader, you really need to be looking as your team is the producer instead of you individually too, and then stop evaluating yourself on that productivity, because that puts you in a
Hmm.
box. Anyway, I
Absolutely.
digress.
No, not at all. Not at all. Because well, I like the way you said, like, okay, you were leaning into the fact that, like, yeah, you have to open up and be like, okay, I don't know everything. And maybe I don't have to. And allow yourself to be in this open, unknown. And I talk about it in the book. I think I might call it the no man's land. There's like this place where as you're learning and growing, you're suboptimal, you don't know, you're becoming the leader, and hopefully we're constantly in a state of becoming. We cycle through this, we become, or we learn, and then we know, and then we don't know something, and then we have to become, and then we learn. It's like this constant growth thing. But
Mhm.
it's okay. That's actually that very uncomfortable space is where it's at.
Yeah, and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And I feel like, growth mindset and being able to kind of get out of the war consciousness allows you to to not feel as vulnerable, not knowing, because I'm just curious. I'm trying to, you know, this is my opportunity to get my hands around things versus, I have to be the knower of all things.
And you said so when you're in war consciousness, you knowing a lot of times or being the expert is your defense mechanism. So in more consciousness, you're not going to be vulnerable. It's a liability. Like you're not going to be the one who doesn't know because it feels like a liability. Now, if you step out of the war consciousness and you realize that a lot of that is just fabricated narrative, there are some people that might be out to get you, but it's
Sure.
really not everybody. Most people are not. They're just trying to figure themselves out.
They're focused on themselves. Yep.
So if you move over into the love consciousness where you give yourself the space to slow down and think about it and learn and grow, you become a more effective leader. You come up with more creative solutions and you have better relationships.
Yeah, I mean, it reduces the amount of fear that you have if you're not always in this fight or flight mode, right? It's you remove that fear, you can be more creative. I mean, plenty of studies have prove that to be the case, and so where you can get yourself to that place more quickly, the more effective and more creative, and I think a more relatable individual you become too.
Yeah. I think that's where the relationships really take off is when you start to really lean in, just abandon the war consciousness
Yeah.
and then lean into the love consciousness. It's not that you don't defend what needs to be defended, you're just not defensive or
Yes.
you're not walking around looking for a fight or trying to be right or trying to make somebody wrong just so that you can feel better. You're
Yeah.
actually confident.
Yeah.
You're okay with yourself.
Yeah. It's a practice though. It doesn't come, and I fall back into it
Mm-hmm.
often, even recently, where I felt like I was in that war consciousness constantly. And it it was hard for me to, in those moments, to realize I was there and react and behave differently. Really
Mm-hmm.
hard. Almost like I got to take notes on how I need to behave. Because I can easily get into like deep anger and fight mode. And instead, like, what, but that would not have been something I would have planned for or been aware of before our time together. And so I do think the practice is so critical to, you had said one point, like, leave my book by your bedside. I will be your, your Bible. And you didn't say Bible, but and that's true, because I do think you come back to some of those excerpts and reminders really quickly to just reset and
Yeah.
practice.
Yeah, it is a practice. And that's also, you have to always, that's why I wrote the book, you know, lots of little chapters, 52 chapters, 52 weeks, little parts, bite-sized pieces, because it is an incremental shift every little bit of the way. And you have to keep practicing. Our brains are already hardwired into so many of these patterns of thought and
Yeah.
reaction. We've picked them up over the years, and some of them, even some of the belief systems that are now very negative, like not good enough, those are very anchored in our peptide pathways or in our vision of ourselves, because at some point, thinking you're not good enough made you better.
This is true. Yeah.
So it's not
Right.
like it's wrong. It's just no longer appropriate to beat yourself down with the idea that you're not good enough, but rather to face something more objective and
Mhm.
discernible.
Yeah. And yeah, that's a good point, because I do think, like, you, some of those things that have made you who you are, and what you've said to yourself and repeated those stories on your head of the things that you've said over and over again, have sometimes helped to create the person that you are. So two things can be true at the same time. They're good and bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Which means and then that's a very love conscious statement, because there's this third thing where you're neither good or bad. It's this is the way it is. Like, that's okay. You said
Yeah.
it's good and bad. So it's neither right nor wrong.
Right.
It's This is how it rolled out. You've
Mm-hmm.
got good things from it. There's less optimal, less desirable effects that you can maybe leave behind, that you don't need to have.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the L&D part of this.
Mhm.
Um, what are your thoughts about, like, if an organization were to adopt
Yeah.
moving through this, like moving out of war consciousness into love consciousness, what group dynamic would you see happening?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said. A lot of the research and things that I'm reading right now are all around creating inclusive work environments and inclusive cultures, and but where does that all come from? What is go down deeper than that? And that is, um inclusivity has to happen happens when you have trust. And that's, trust within the groups that you're working with, but you have to, deeper than that is, you have to actually be okay with yourself and others. And you have to trust yourself and others, right? So there's really deeply rooted things and your own kind of discovery of yourself and understanding self in order to really determine how, or really influence how you work with others. So I kind of feel like there's a little bit of like self-reflection and therapy that people need in order to get to a point where they can actually be inclusive leaders. This is what I hear a lot right now is we need to have inclusive leadership, and we need training for our managers or our leaders on how do we become inclusive leaders. Well, there's a lot to be said for that. Like, where does that come from? Why aren't we right now? What's holding us back from being inclusive leaders right now? What are we missing? And I would say a lot of it, a lot of it is this deep self-reflection. Um, and again, this is like what I see very similar to work consciousness. Like, what's preventing them is, that there's deeply rooted reasons and as to who people are, and then deeply rooted reasons as to why they behave the way that they do. And right, so there's so many competing um, ways in which people are operating, or competing personalities and baggage. We all have our baggage and where we're coming from and perspective. So I don't know. I think it's work consciousness in kind of corporate America sounds a lot like inclusive leadership. But even that doesn't get down to the level of things that we're talking about that
Yeah.
deep self-reflection.
Yeah. So that's a really good point, because we talk so much about including others, right? It's supposed to be like diversity, including others, but the only way we can get into anything that is beyond self and world, or self and other, is to get out of war consciousness, because self and
Yes.
other is the basis of war consciousness, which means, like, I have an inner world and I have an outer world.
Mhm.
That's it. Like, that duality, we have to get beyond this sense of self that's divided just like inside outside.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
not enough.
Right.
It's not enough.
So
And that's the fun.
what's the middle ground?
Well, I mean, and that's the that's also like a lot of the psychology that we've grown up with is about inner outer. There's this basic idea that it's me and the world, which actually is not really true. We just had a pandemic. We are not independent. That's a lie. There's no independence in the world. Like,
Mhm.
I might independently walk around the room in a separate body, but that's about it because we share the same air, water, the ecosystem we're in. We're all these little parts, like little ants, in this massive ecosystem. This
Mhm.
massive ecosystem is regulated by love consciousness, basically, or the, whatever's happening in the E field, if you want to go all quantum or whatever, it doesn't really matter. We're all connected and interdependent. We're
Yes.
not codependent, we're interdependent.
Yeah.
And therefore, what you do affects me, what I do
Yes.
affects you.
Hmm.
And it doesn't matter who's the me and who's the you. At some point, somebody exhaled on the other side of the planet something in the air and it moved its way all across the planet. This is
Yeah.
interconnectivity.
Yeah. And you think about that, um, that interconnected, like, in, again, going back to kind of corporate world, interconnectivity, right? We just had a new CEO join the organization, and the old CEO just departed. And all of a sudden, everybody's feeling a bit uneasy and they're not sure because everybody's feeling the shift. It's like they don't really know exactly what it is, but there's something shifting. And that's that interdependency of like, well, I don't know what his expectations are, or what he's going to be looking for priority wise. And so there's all this kind of nebulous stuff, which, it's that interdependencies that we can't, we putting your finger on it's really hard.
Yes, absolutely. Because it's not some left brain, check the box Excel sheet that we can do to make ourselves feel better and pretend that that's concrete. Like, I've never seen a budget that ever worked out the way we planned it. That just doesn't happen. Like, we like to it's good to put out plans, but we also have to constantly pivot because that's not going to happen. So there's always all of these other things happening
Mhm.
that are beyond us, that regulate us, that we as intelligent evolving beings need to be looking at and trying to understand so that we can better participate with them. And
Mhm.
that's a big part of the love consciousness. And I think, like, there is a point where we can introduce certain mindsets. Like, you mentioned growth mindset. Growth
Mhm.
mindset has had a great impact on executives. Just understanding, oh, it's possible to have a growth. Oh, we can do that. I have permission, and I can think outside the box, and I can think towards a solution rather than, like, go along to get along. You mean that I can do that?
Mhm.
And I think that's what we need to do also with understanding you don't have to stay in this war consciousness. You're not a unit of productivity. You don't need to squelch yourself like that. In a
Mhm.
war conscious, you don't have to be right. It's okay to be wrong. And moving away from the war consciousness towards self and others in that divided, rigid state, reactive state, into a
Mhm.
creative, love conscious state. It's okay. You can actually go here. You can be
Mhm.
a much more open, thinking, softer person,
Mhm.
and you can actually do some things from this place. Doesn't mean you show up, all squishy every day. That's what some people think.
Yeah, right.
No, but you can be this higher being
Mhm.
where, and the reason we call it love consciousness is because it's kind of like get out of your head, drop down into your heart.
Mhm. Mhm.
Being that allows you to be more inclusive. That allows you to see someone else's thing without having to be right or
Yeah.
judge.
And I don't know, for me, that was, that was a reflection point of like, there's this fear of judgment, this fear of being wrong, a fear of not looking like I have the answers or being smart. That those things, once you start to unpack them and do away with that judgment of yourself, essentially, you can be more open and you can be more, you can ask deeper questions and not be so in fear of, will I look silly or dumb or what have you. You can get to solutions faster. You can get to creative solutions faster. So it was definitely part of my journey, is realizing that.
Yeah. And I think there's the part where, because corporate America is not going to flip their switch overnight, right? It's going to be led by individuals like yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to kind of unhook from the fitting in and knowing that you actually belong. You on your life journey, you have a reason to be here. You might be the change agent, and you might be the one that's going to be the bright light who's going to model a model of love consciousness in the workplace that's not
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally love conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And but when you belong to yourself,
Right.
as a whole human, and you elevate yourself into this love consciousness, you don't need to fit in so badly.
Yeah. Yes. Agreed. Mm-hmm.
You become whole, and
Mm-hmm.
you're more relaxed, you're happier, you're more confident, you're more resilient for the most part. It's not that everything's okay. You're just okay.
Right. I mean, it's not rainbows and sunshine and everything's peachy, right? So that's not what we're talking about. It's really being okay with yourself, really understanding yourself deeply and being okay with that's who you are, right? Kind of going back to the comment we made earlier, like these two things may be true at the same time, right? Like this is what got you here, but no judgment is being passed on it, but do you have to actually continue to be in that same space? So
Yeah, I love that. I love
mm,
that. Well, I'm going to thank you for coming on today. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And I guess I like your last statement about, you
yeah,
know, two things can happen and what got you here, and you
yeah,
can flip the
that's
switch and enjoy that journey. Thank you so
well,
much.
thank you, Dr. Terry. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode from start to finish. It is always a pleasure to reach a fellow love-conscious human. If you want to expand on your consciousness education, check out the book, Flip Your Switch, on Amazon, and the courses on loveconscioushuman.com. Or you can book a private coaching session with me. We hope you'll join us again. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Let's come together to crowdsource a love-conscious world.